And thank you for joining us. And I want to welcome our live audience for this for today's report presentation and discussion, and also our online audience. We appreciate folks tuning in. And we look forward to the opportunity to talk to you about the effects of consolidation on competition in the defense industry. And I want to begin by acknowledging the grant funding that we received from the Naval Postgraduate School, which enabled the research behind the report that my deputy Greg Sanders is going to present to you today to be done. And so we really value that support, and we want to thank them for that and acknowledge their sponsorship. I also want to do, as we do always, remind you about our security approach here at CSIS, which is if for any reason we were to have to leave the building during today's event, I would be your security officer and would give you further guidance on what to do, either to exit out the back the way you came in or out behind me, depending on what the situation would be. But we don't anticipate that. It's really a pleasure to get together, talk about consolidation and the threat of monopolies within industrial sectors. And as for those of you who've had a chance to look at the report, I think it went live on our website today. And if people were really eagle-eyed, they might have spotted that it accidentally went live briefly on Friday before we realized that was a mistake. But for those who've had a chance to look at it, it makes clear that across the U.S. economy, there is this trend towards increased consolidation. It's I think, a fairly significant thing happening in the U.S. economy today. And so as people working on Defense Industrial Initiatives Group, which is the title of our group here at CSIS, we really wanted to see how that trend played out specifically in the area of defense contracting. Now, defense contracting has historically always been seen as, and in fact, some of the data we have shows that there's truth in this, as a pretty highly consolidated sector of industry to begin with. And so you start with a certain degree of consolidation, and then we wanted to see what the trends were in recent years. And of course, there's the famous Last Supper in the 1990s, in which the Department of Defense directly and explicitly encouraged consolidation in the defense industry in the wake of the Cold War. We briefly considered using a picture of the Last Supper as the cover of this report. Ultimately, we decided that it's possible that someone in our audience might not get the reference, and so we decided to go with something a little more anodyne, which is a picture from the Reagan Forum, which is the largest gathering in the U.S. of defense industry folks, and we thought that kind of told the story as well. So this study, Greg will explain in greater detail what we looked at, how we looked at it, and why we looked at it, and then we will welcome up our all-star panel who have deep experience in the history of consolidation in the defense industry and its implications for national security. And now I will turn the podium over to Greg.
So for this study, we were trying to look at multiple different hypotheses and had reviewed the literature. And one of the first things that stands out about the literature about industrial consolidation and economics is that it doesn't always just go in one particular direction. In theory, concentration can result from economies of scale and learning curves. In those cases, a larger firm might be able to perform better. There are also areas like government policy, which can encourage consolidation, and monopoly, which is particularly relevant for the defense sector. Though, of course, there's a particular fear of barriers to entry and other trust behaviors that could greatly undercut performance. And those have actually been increasingly prominent in discussions of larger issues of competition, monopoly, and the larger economy. We wanted to bring those down and do some of the quantitative research for our particular sector. One thing this research looks at is specifically performance as an output measure. As is pretty well established, current monopoly policy in the US economy writ large really emphasizes price, good for the consumer. So that if two major companies coming together, either through various arrangements made with DOJ or through analysis isn't likely to actually drive up prices. It might be allowed, even if it greatly increases the market power of those firms. One thing that's been pushed back by some of the recent literature is that price is too narrow of a criteria to look at. It's obviously important, but whether effects for the workplace, whether a variety, effects for the supply chain, whether a variety of other areas might be influenced by concentration, even if it wasn't necessarily showing up in a price signal. So for this particular report, we're looking at performance, again, the measures we use, and we try to look at the relationship between concentration and competition. Generally speaking, a lot of the literature, concentration isn't thought to have a direct effect, or at least the negative effects aren't supposed to be direct. It's the suppression of competition that can lead to bad outcomes. So our first hypothesis, as I covered, is that industrial concentration leads to changes in contract performance. It can be potentially good, or potentially you reduce the need to actually care about what your customer wants, which is the bad side. The second hypothesis is a bit more straightforward, that concentration just leads to decreases in competition. So if competition is the channel for concentration, can we see that concentration goes up, competition goes down? And the third one is, the conventional competition leads to better performance. A mainstay of economics, though with a variety of simplifying assumptions typically, and with defense acquisition, monopoly is potentially a complication to that particular assumption. So we look at a variety of input and control variables, but I'll start with the inputs. So for competition, we broke it into 5 categories. No competition, sole source, one offer. So this means a competition was held, but only one vendor responded. We've, following DoD, sometimes only considered it to be effective competition as you go to 2 offers or more. Then we break it into 2 offers, 3 to 4, and 5+. For concentration, we use the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. This gets a little wonky, so I won't go into too much detail there. But essentially, you take the square of the market portion for each provider. So this cares a lot about the biggest firm, a little less about the second firm, et cetera. The main competing mechanism would be like looking at the percentage that's held by the top 4 firms. That has value, but there's a little more granularity in the HHI. So we went with that. And then to elaborate a little on HHI and what it actually means for the defense industry, this one we actually did not break out by NAICS sector. We do the rest of the report by the North American Industrial Classification System. But for this one, we wanted to focus on our traditional acquisition categories. So the DOJ has standards broadly about 1,500. Let's see, how it works. Yeah. So the lower line on each of these charts is the 1,500 mark, the upper line being 2,500. As you get into between those 2 dashed lines, you're moderately consolidated. As you get above, you're highly consolidated. So you can see in the upper left, aircraft and drones has been working up some in recent years. Ships and submarines has been about at the lower line. Land vehicles is actually not that consolidated. Space systems is pretty high. Unfortunately, the reduction in space systems in this particular chart is driven by joint ventures, which the HHI has a little trouble sorting out, rather than being, say, the entrance of SpaceX or other competitors. And in air and missile defense, you can see that even in this period, even from 2007 to 2015, where we're concentrating, there's been a great deal of fluctuation. So largely, when we're measuring concentration, we go to a North American Industrial Classification System. The nice thing about these, they're not really tuned for defense. As you can see, most of it is concentrated in manufacturing and wholesale trade. But the really helpful part is that we can compare statistics for defense acquisition with the overall economy. And I'm going to refer to NAICS subsectors and detailed industries. NAICS codes are 6 digits. You can see that, I give one example. You can always see what each level is by just limiting the first couple of digits. So say, for engineering technical systems, 541330 is engineering and technical services. But if you just take the first two digits, 54, you're in professional services. So the two levels we look at are subsector performance, which is the 3-digit, and detailed industry, which is the 6-digit. So what does this actually kind of mean? So for here, I try to give some breakdowns and some actual NAICS subsectors that have either a lot of contracts by count, and this includes task order counts, or a lot by dollars. So civil engineering and construction is actually a relatively unconsolidated area for defense. By comparison, transportation equipment, and almost all weapon systems fall in transportation equipment, it's a little more, wholesalers, oddly, is actually relatively high, despite being not that consolidated in the overall economy. So as you can see in the top row, there's a fair amount of variation from sector to sector. The second row looks at how many obligations there are in each sector. So weapon system, falling in transportation, is actually the highest on those. And the third one we have a ratio of defense to the overall economy. So this is a apples to oranges comparison, I want to be clear. But we look at how much there is for defense obligations going out to contractors, and this is prime obligations, versus the total value of those sectors in the economic census, which is done every 5 years. So you can see that like transportation, defense has a pretty large chunk of transportation, even at this broad categorization. And almost everything else, when we're talking subsectors, defense is a small portion of the overall economy, despite about 300 billion plus in contracts every year. When we look at detailed industry, then you can see somewhere defense is a much bigger player. Not surprisingly, as you get to armored vehicles, that's primarily going to be Department of Defense. Aircraft, is higher than overall transportation, but still only 30%. And most of the other ones actually remain a bit smaller. So for our study, we're not sure whether concentration at the subsector level, so kind of a broad, how much your total market power, how much you're one of the big five, how much that's important, versus the detailed industry, which is where we're getting to, the specific dives, these sort of categories. So we have a variety of other input variables we controlled for. We looked at size, we look at duration, we look at contracting vehicles, pricing, location, and we used a multi-level model that allowed for different intercepts for each contracting office and each NAICS code. If you're interested in hearing more about multi-level models, talk to me afterwards. I don't think this is for the general audience. So for output variables, we looked at number of offers. We looked at whether there was a partial or complete termination. And that can happen for a lot of reasons. It's only so much of a story, but it's still worth tracking. We looked at ceiling breaches. And to be a ceiling breach for us, it meant that your cost ceiling went up because of a change order. If your cost ceiling went up because more work was ordered, we didn't count that because that's not necessarily a bad signal. That could be the government being very happy with you. A change order isn't necessarily bad news, but on the whole, you don't want too many change orders that increase your cost ceilings. So when we get to the actual results, for concentration, we didn't find anything for ceiling breaches. One thing we thought there might be that if you have a great deal of market power, the government might only be able to push you so hard on price, so the price estimates, there's less of a temptation to aggressively bid and the like. For terminations, we do see a result at the subsector level, and it's fairly strong. And that result correlates, or it has an interaction with the subsector ratio. So in essence, concentration matters most if you're in a sector where defense is a large player. If you're in a sector where there's a larger commercial sector, subsector proportionally, then you have the escape valve, presumably, and so concentration doesn't matter as much. So wholesaler, one firm might be dominant for DoD, but if DoD needs another wholesaler, they can find another wholesaler. Let's see. For competition, the results surprised us a lot. We actually found that, generally speaking, more offers were associated, and again, there are a variety of potential reasons for this, with worse results. One reason might be aggressive bidding. One thing that we'll cover later is that in our two measures, price is not one of our metrics. So it would make a lot of sense if competition was very effective at driving down price, but also sometimes leading to aggressive bidding. From an expected value perspective, the government might still be getting a good deal, even if terminations and ceiling breaches are more likely, because if on the whole you're saving money and at the tail end you have slightly worse results, that's not that bad. However, it's still something we noted. And somewhat to our surprise, while we have long poo-pooed competition with a single offer, it actually was associated with slightly better results for ceiling breaches. So merely having the competition, even if only one vendor showed up, had slightly positive effects by that metric. So seeking to get to our panel, because a lot of the larger issues are, as important, if not more important, than some of the specific things we can measure, we did find that subsector concentration is associated with a greater risk of terminations. We also found that, straightforwardly, concentration is associated with fewer offers, as you would expect. We expected it to maybe be a little stronger than it was. Other factors were similar in importance and strength. But nonetheless, the intuition that more concentration equals fewer offers and less competition did hold up. The competition results were surprising to us, and we think there's a lot of room to maybe look for aggressive bidding or other possible drivers for that phenomenon in future research. There was a lot of variety by sectors. One thing that surprised us slightly, differences between contracting offices proved more important than differences between industrial sectors. And there's a variety of potential reasons. In future research, we're going to try to look closer at that. One reason might be the power of favored vehicles, which can vary greatly from contracting office and are actually a little more specific than NAICS sectors in terms of telling you about what's being bought and what the risks are. So in how to build on it, we'd emphasize trade-offs and understanding that not all good things necessarily go together. Sometimes if you're most concerned with cost, then competition is probably still the best way to go, but understand that there may be sometimes some other tail-end risk to watch for. And being aware of risk tolerance, we hope that the data set we're providing can actually help there, and contracting officers could potentially look at, what is the failure rate for my sector, for my office, et cetera. Is that above or below what I'm willing to tolerate, and guide accordingly. Finally, we're making this data set available to future researchers. If you think you could do it better, we'd be happy to provide it to you and give you your best shot, or if you'd like to build on our work. There's a lot of areas that I think we could go next for this. For example, we just look at a unidirectional measure of consolidation. Maybe there's a sweet spot. Up to a certain level, more consolidation is good. Above that, it's bad. That sort of thing. Similarly, different measures for vehicles and pricing mechanisms might work better at different levels of consolidation, et cetera. Regardless, thank you for all coming. Thanks to the panel, and I look forward to their discussion. And thank you for Naval Postgraduate School for making this research possible. And my co-author, Zach Huitnik, who could not be here, but was at the University of Syracuse and is much smarter than I am on many statistical matters and made this possible.
Thank you, Greg. And to bring some further insight into what these findings might mean for policy and policymakers, we have assembled a great panel that I'm going to introduce now and let them dig deeper into the implications of consolidation in the defense industry and what you need to know about it. To my right is Frank Kendall. Full disclosure, my former boss, I think a lot of you know that, but he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics for 6 or 7 years in the previous administration. He is currently a consultant to defense industry, a member of several corporate boards, including Leidos. He is a senior advisor, a non-resident senior advisor at CSIS, and a executive in residence at Renaissance Strategic Advisors. He is a multiple threat as an engineer and a lawyer, and has some interesting perspectives, has some interesting experience in his government service with issues of consolidation in the defense industry. To his right is Mr. Barry Lin, who is Executive Director of the Open Markets Institute. He has really focused on issues of consolidation in the economy, and so we're very pleased he could join us today. He, prior to helping to found, I believe, the Open Markets Institute, he was at the New America Foundation, and prior to that was editor at Global Business Magazine. So thank you for joining us. To his right is Ms. Marjorie Sensor, who is the editor at Inside Defense. For those of you who follow her writing know that she focuses quite a bit on M&A and market strategies of players in the defense industry. So she writes on these topics constantly and is a great source of information about what is in fact happening in the defense industry. Prior to her current position, she wrote for the Washington Post and their Capital Business Journal, and also previously at Inside the Army and Politico. And to her right is Mr. Pierre Chow, who is the founding partner of Renaissance Strategic Advisors and also co-founder of Enlightenment Capital. He is also affiliated with CSIS as an advisor and previously, and most illustriously, as I always like to say, as former director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at CSIS. And prior to his time at CSIS, he was at Credit Suisse First Boston and has been a market analyst observing defense industry and advising mergers and acquisitions for a long time. And if he wants to reveal exactly how long, I'll let him do that. He has also been a member of the DSB and the DBB and some of their studies of industry. And so really glad that we could put this group together for today's discussion. And I just kind of want to start with giving each of you an opportunity to talk about what you see as the most important trends or the most important things happening in terms of consolidation in industry, whether that's the trends that you observe occurring or what the implications, what you think the impacts are for the industry with what has come to pass. So I'll just kind of start with some general thoughts. They don't have to relate to our study, but it's lovely if they do. Frank, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everybody. I'll say a few words to get things going. I could probably talk for quite a long time on this subject. First of all, I want to applaud the work that Andrew and his team have done, Greg and your partner in this. I used to have a sign outside my door in the Pentagon that said, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And I always applaud any effort to do some actual analysis of the numbers and trends to try to learn from that and try to understand what works and what doesn't. So you've added to that body of knowledge considerably. You also have increased my knowledge of the Hirschman Index. And natural logarithms came back to me as I was reading through this quite a bit too, and a number of other things. And if you haven't done the exercise of trying to figure out that index and what it actually means, it's kind of fun to do it. So just do it in your head. But it's a pretty logical index, actually, when you think about it. So I applaud what you've done here. I think it adds to the body of knowledge. But you see some things, I think, which are pointers to additional work. I think while the analysis can help you, I'd be a little leery of using it as a basis for decision making. I thought as I was reading about how we make decisions about acquisition strategies and so on, what kind of contract to use, things like that. And I think those are much more driven by the specifics of the case you have than the generalities that were to some degree revealed here. As far as consolidation itself is concerned, I think the traditional concerns about competition and innovation are valid. I don't think your results refute that. And we have some interesting things to say about competition. It really doesn't get at the degree of innovation that you get. My own experience in defense acquisition goes back about 40, 45 years. And part of that was being at Raytheon as a member of the corporate staff, chief engineer, when we bought a company called E-Systems. And I'll never forget the dramatically different cultures of the two companies. Raytheon had been engaged in a number of competitions with Hughes Aircraft at the time, mostly for different missile systems. And there was a lot of tension in the company. There was a lot of focus. There was a sense of urgency about things. We were always trying to get cost out. We were always looking for better designs that beat Hughes. E-Systems have been in the sole source business of supporting the intelligence community quite a bit. And it was a remarkably relaxed group of people compared to the executives at Raytheon. That's not good or bad. It's an artifact of the types of business they were in. But the point I'm making is that competition does work to stimulate cost cutting and innovation. When I look at the industry today, the concern that I had when I was in government, and I expressed it pretty vocally at the time of the Lockheed-Sikorsky merger, was about the monotonically decreasing function of the number of defense firms, particularly at the prime level. Secretary Carter originally, when he was undersecretary, put out a policy which I continued, which was we were discouraging mergers at the senior top tier of the industry, and that we'd look at things below that level individually on a case-by-case basis. That's essentially been continued by this administration. So there hasn't been an attempt to merge any of the big six with each other, just pick those as the top ones. But there have been a number of moves of second-tier, if you will, companies together, and some moves of top-tier companies to pick up second-tier companies. And there's been some movement in the services side just as much as in the product side. At this point, I'm not overly concerned by where things are. I don't think we need to be. There's still a reasonable amount of competition. I do think that after the Last Supper that Andrew mentioned, we may have gone too far in terms of reducing the number of primes at the top. And that was my concern when Lockheed brought Sikorsky. And the obvious concerns of competition and innovation, loss of innovation, and the incentives to that are part of this. But the other thing that doesn't come out, I think, in your study, but which I think is also very much a factor, and it certainly was for me, was the degree of political clout that bigger firms have relative to smaller firms. And as you consolidate and as you gain basically not just a corporate entity or a business person entity you have to do with, but a political entity, a political actor. My very first meeting on the Hill when I came back to the government in 2010 was that I was summoned to see the chairman of one of the armed services committees. And the reason I was summoned was so that he could give me a hard time, frankly, about having not awarded a contract to a particular contractor yet. We were in negotiations. They were difficult negotiations. And I always told my contracting people, I want you to, don't let time be on the other guy's side. Be willing to take the time to do a negotiation and get a reasonable deal for the government. So here was an Armed Services Committee chairman putting pressure on me to get the contract signed. And I explained to him that I thought it was in the best interest of the government to continue the negotiation until we got a good price. I don't know how persuasive I was, and he couldn't order me to over the contract, but he was doing his best to get me to do it. That's the type of thing that occurs in real life, and it occurs really often. As companies gain political clout, they often will, and I suggested to Andrew a follow-on study on this, they will keep things in the budget that the department may not want anymore. It's very hard to shut down a production line, and there are plenty of examples of that. So that aspect of it is unique, and there are a number of other things that are very unique to the defense industry, and I'd be wary of comparisons to the commercial world because of this. I'm just going to mention a few, and then I'll stop and give somebody else a turn. When we have competition, particularly for the larger contracts, the major weapon systems, which I was most concerned with, that competition is usually for development. It's not for production. We don't have two sources of production. We have one source. We're sole source by the time we get there. We have competition for development, and then we usually award a single development contract. The commercial industry doesn't do that at all. The commercial industry doesn't contract for development. Companies pay for their own development, and then they bring products to the market, and then people get to buy them or not. That's not the way defense industry works. It's very different. So we're competing something very different, essentially, than the commercial world is. It's an incredibly heavily regulated industry already. So the opportunity to increase your margins significantly, whether there's competition or not, are very limited. When we're in a sole source world, we look at the costs and we look at the profit. We have weighted guidelines we use that we impose in our contracting. And I know the defense industry over the years has been under pressure from the Wall Street and so on and investors to try to raise their margins. The government is not going to allow defense contractors, I think, to raise their margins too much. They're going to be, you're working for the taxpayers, essentially, and you're providing for the national security of the nation. And you're not a utility exactly as a defense contractor, but you're in a business that's going to be highly regulated, and that's going to include your profitability. We want some margin there to incentivize people, but it's not going to be dramatic. The growth opportunities in the defense industry are totally dependent upon the federal budget, particularly the defense budget. It's not as if you can create a better widget and have people come and buy an awful lot of them all of a sudden. It's not going to happen. Your sales are fundamentally capped by how much is available in the budget and allocated generally to the area that you're in the business of doing. They're very high barriers to entry. You occasionally will have a SpaceX or something like that come along. There are a few other examples like that. But generally speaking, the defense industrial base we have, particularly at the top, is the industrial base we're going to have. As you go down, that becomes a little less true as you get to smaller businesses which have niche capabilities. But by and large, at least at the top tier, there are very strong barriers to entry, and that affects how things like the analysis that Andrew's team did will be affected. And it's a very complex regulatory environment. It's a difficult one to work in. So all those things affect the defense industrial base, make it somewhat unique. So they all come together when you think about the virtues or the lack of virtues, the cost of consolidation. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Frank. Barry.
Well, thank you guys for having me. It's an honor to be here. I think Andrew just wanted to start off by agreeing with Frank that Andrew's work, this is a great sort of addition to our sort of understanding of this issue. It's an important study, and it's exciting to have it. And it's, I also just wanted to say that, I agree with Frank that in this area, within the U.S. economy as a whole, in the sort of, defense procurement, it's probably, we don't see a crisis here in any real sense, and it's, partly due to the work that Frank did while he was in office. Just going to make a couple of points, and which I think will sort of put this into a larger frame. And first is that what has not been really well reported in the United States, people are just kind of coming to understand this, is the magnitude of the change in competition policy that took place in the early 80s. And this was, this was a decade before the Last Supper, but this was a, sort of the very short history of American anti-monopoly. Basically, is from 1773, from the Boston Tea Party until for 200 years plus. The basic purpose of anti-monopoly was political. We used anti-monopoly law to protect certain liberties, to engage in marketplaces. We used anti-monopoly to protect against concentration of economic power and economic control as a way of, protecting our democracy. We used anti-monopoly as a way of protecting communities. It was there were social goals. In the early 80s, there was a very radical change. As some of you guys have heard about this. This was driven by people from the Chicago School of Economics, from the Robert Bork, the judge. He wrote a book called The Antitrust Paradox. And basically, we went from an approach to anti-monopoly policy in the general economy that was designed to distribute power and distribute opportunity and distribute capacity to one that, because it prioritized efficiency foremost. So what we ended up with is a system that's really designed to concentrate power. And now this was not something, this was the Reagan administration that sort of put it into place, but the Democratic administrations since then have sort of basically kept this new approach to antitrust philosophy. So this is not a left-right thing. It's not an R versus D thing. This is, both parties were sort of complicit in the changes, and to the extent we're seeing sort of people starting to challenge where we are, we see people from both parties that are now challenging sort of the 1981 consensus on antitrust. A couple of things that are specific to this issue is, consolidation one of the things that is not in this study that's important for this, for the defense sort of industrial base is the consolidation that's taken place in the general commercial economy. We see extreme consolidation in industrial sectors. There was an article in the New York Times a couple weeks ago about Apple and their, they assemble one type of MacBook in Texas. And they were talking about one of the reasons they don't do that anymore, that they're not going to be expanding that, is because they can't get the screws to assemble this type of computer. And until 2004, these screws were manufactured in bulk in the United States, but because of the entire sort of the offshoring of almost all the assembly capacity for that kind of computer, the screws followed, and they don't exist here anymore. And anyone in the business knows, you kind of have to have your industrial supplier relatively close to the final assembly if you're going to be changing your work in any way. But we've seen this throughout the political economy. So it's like this. And as a result, the commercial industrial economy, which for many decades supported the defense industrial economy, is a much less robust support than it used to be. And that's a key factor. It drives up costs, and it creates sort of vulnerabilities. And then sort of, what kind of vulnerabilities, and this is something I think that, I'll just give you a couple of examples of one of the things, I wrote a book that came out in 2005. It was called End of the Line, and it was about supply chains. It was about the first supply chain crash, which happened back in 1999. And this was after an earthquake in Taiwan, and we saw sort of a cascading collapse of industrial activity because of the loss of access to semiconductor foundries in Hsinchu. Now, what that sort of event, I spent 6 years sort of unpacking that event, and one of the things that event sort of showed is that sort of industrial firms often have no idea what's going on in tier 2 or tier 3 of their supply chain. They have zero idea. So it's like, there are extreme concentrations of capacity for little tiny things sometimes, like those screws I mentioned, or it could be certain kinds of semiconductors that are invisible to us. Now that has a cost effect, but it has a loss of sort of capacity to understand certain types of activities. We just don't understand how certain things are made anymore. That's a problem for us in terms of our ability to sort of understand the full range of threats that we may face. And it also creates these sort of larger, industrial vulnerabilities that are kind of outside the scope of this discussion, but are important, which is that when you have sort of all capacity for vital sources, for like keystone components, for vital sources of supply located in one place, that creates a risk of catastrophic failure of systems. That's a too big to fail issue. And since I wrote about that, since I published the book, Cornered End of the Line in 2005, there has been zero. People understand the risk more than they did 15 years ago, but there's been zero effort to mitigate that risk. So, so that's connected to how we source capacity, but it's somewhat extraneous to the immediate question at hand, which is concentration within the defense industrial sphere.
Well, thank you, Barry. Marjorie.
First, thank you for having me, and thank you for noticing how much I write about M&A. And I just wanted to spend a couple minutes to kind of talk about from listening to all these companies, what sort of the drivers are for them when they're thinking about consolidation. And I sort of think about these companies in two groups: the sort of the products guys led by the big six, which sort of been prohibited from combining, and then the services guys, where there's actually been a lot more activity. in recent years, and we saw Leidos kind of set the new bar at $10 billion when it acquired Lockheed Martin's IT services business, and SAIC and Agility is a more recent one. But even in the product side, we're not seeing those big 6 combined, but we're seeing Northrop acquire Orbital ATK, and then the proposed L3 and Harris merger. And I think of them in these groups, but really what I hear from the companies on why they want to consolidate, it's the same factors for both groups. And of course, the number one factor that they're citing is cost. You look at some of the numbers, L3 said that it could save $500 million in annual synergies for the third year by combining with Harris. SAIC said $150 million a year in savings by the end of the second year in the Agility deal. And they're pinning that some on the government too. They're saying the government is demanding lower prices, and that pushes them to do it. There's also been the argument, what the companies would say, which you can agree with or not, is that can free up money for innovation, that can allow them to do different things. L3 made that specific argument in arguing why it should merge with Harris. That we also have heard companies say that this greater scale can give them the ability to deal with uncertainty. And the most recent one is pointing to the government shutdown. The larger you are, the smaller the portion of your revenue that might be affected by that shutdown, and the more able you are to weather that. We also are seeing large contract vehicles as a driver. Companies say they need to be on these vehicles, and so you need to have a lot of capabilities. You need to have the scale to sort of have this whole array of contract vehicles if that's the way the government is going to buy. And then I'll keep it brief, but the other factors, I think there is still this sense, and I wasn't covering it in the 90s, but I understand there was a sense in the 90s that if you don't act, you're sort of the passive part of this. And I'll turn to the quote that I found as I was kind of thinking about this issue. The CFO of General Dynamics last year was talking about why they acquired CSRA, and he said, we've seen over the past several years a consolidation around us in this market to the point that it's made us, instead of a top 1 or 2 player, we're now back in the middle of the pack. In a consolidating market, our thesis is that you either have to consolidate or get consolidated out. And I think there is the sense that if you don't move to protect your business or to make yourself a larger business, that you are sort of the prey for these other companies. So I'll just leave it at that. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Marjorie. Pierre.
Again, thank you, Andrew, and Greg, thanks for letting me satiate my inner data geek in terms of going through this study. But I think and you've picked up this theme throughout the prior comments. One of the ways to breathe, I think, life into the data is to map it with the context, right, in which it's occurring. And there's a couple of contexts that's important to note, and I would argue sort of drives a lot of this. One is the customer's behavior, the budgetary, the programmatic context, right? There's been a very simple correlate from the perspective of the number of programs that the companies have an opportunity to bid on drives the number of companies that's there, right? We used to have a half dozen aircraft houses. There were companies that were known as being a Navy house. Northrop Grumman was a Navy house. Lockheed was known as an Air Force house. You go to a joint strike fighter, one fighter, for the entirety of the next 20 years, and guess how many companies that ends up supporting. And so you shouldn't be shocked when the industry reacts in terms of reacting to that. When I was on the street and we were following the stocks, when McDonnell Douglas lost the FY23 competition, the stock moved, and everybody knew that at some point something was going to happen there, right? So this element about you get what you wish for from the perspective of the customer in terms of how many programs you're putting out there for people to chase, right, I think is an element that drives that. Marjorie hinted at this. There's also another, call it a strategic context, themes of the day. And Barry, it's interesting, I had never heard the story from the antitrust philosophy change, but the 1980s was also the rise of portfolio theory, the rise of debt for the LBO shops, and so the other thing that you not only changed 100 years worth of antitrust thesis, but 100 years of American industrial structure centered around the multi-industrial firms, the large conglomerates, right? Every defense company was a part of a major conglomerate. And Wall Street stepped in and said, if I have that freedom, I will create these concentrated players. And it completely short-circuited Jack Gensler's view of what should happen in the 90s slowdown, which was we should create a large defense and commercial military industrial complex that was, which is how the industry had survived prior downturns for the last 100 years. And instead, what became the answer was, no, I'm going to build these dedicated defense houses that have that efficiency, that meant more this new thesis. So the strategic context at that time was about bringing that efficiency, and everybody was in the mode of, since I've lost my major demand signal of the Cold War, which was beat the Russians, as long as I was doing something to defeat the Soviets, I was roughly in a place. Almost all the boards of directors and strategic planning shops were like, I don't know what the customer wants, therefore I better have my foot in everything. So that round of 1990s was aircraft houses buying shipyards, shipyards buying land vehicle businesses, and you ended up with a pretty well-diversified, broad set of companies. Then, once everybody was done with that, what was the next thesis, the next strategic context? If you had interviewed, then they'd be sitting there going, I gotta go vertically integrated. I'm a mechanical house, and there's all this newfangled stuff with defense electronics and et cetera, and if I don't control that, I'm gonna be, led behind. A great example of that, and you can see it in the consolidation of the missile business, right? Who were the missile primes of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? Thiokol, et cetera. It essentially was chemical companies, right? Hercules. Because what was the most value-added part of the missile? It was the rocket that made it go from here to there as fast as possible. Who become the prime contractors in the 70s, 80s, 90s? Hughes, Raytheon, Texas Instruments. Why? Because the value-added shifted to the front. It was the seeker, right? And so the next big wave where you saw the changes in concentration was around, I got to drive myself vertical, until the government stepped in and said, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, no, that's too far. I'm not going to let you do that, right? And there's some people in the room that were, involved in that. Then the 2000s actually was about organic growth, and not a lot of people talked about M&A because the growth was back, and I was there. And in fact, if you look at the M&A that was going on at the time, it was, how do I pick up technology and capability sets that the customer wants? And then we have the downturn, and what's been the discussion? It's been about cost, efficiency, how do I gain scale, right? So as you're running through that data, in each one, putting them within those contexts, you'll have part of the story. The third one, and the one I would argue that is also one of the most critical, and this is based on work that we started here at CSIS and then kept picking onwards. And that's surrounding the notion of industrial life cycles. Where is the particular subsegment or industry in its life cycle of technology, right? And every industry has a life cycle. James Utterback at MIT has done a ton of work on this, and some very good work. But essentially the notion that an industry has an entry and experimentation phase. Think of the aircraft industry in the 1920s. Lots of different companies, lots of different answers. Aircraft with 1 wings, 2 wings, 3 wings, engines in the front, in the back, made of paper, wood, aluminum, et cetera. The modern version of that is the UAV industry. Think about how many different answers, solutions, things we have. You would expect to see a whole bunch of companies in that phase of an industry. You would expect to see a particular type of M&A, so Boeing buying Aurora Flight Sciences, right? M&A about, I want us insight into that new technology, but you don't see a lot of concentration. In fact, you have other companies like the brothers Blue, General Atomics essentially sticking their middle finger to everybody who's asked them, do you want to be bought? They're like, no, I'm in a hot sector, I think I can grow. The next stage is an emergence of a dominant design, right? Got it. We're going to have one wing, it's going to be swept, aluminum's the best material, monocoque hull, et cetera, and you start to naturally lose competitors as you start to narrow down in the niche things, right? And the emergence of that standard design, sometimes it has a rhyme or a reason, sometimes doesn't, right? Betamax VHS, I just dated myself, there you go, I told you how long I've been around. The QWERTY keyboard, which is the most insane keyboard layout that you can ever think of, but that's the standard design that we've come around, right? And in some cases, there you'd already start to see some natural concentration of the marketplace. There's a maturity phase of the market, and then ultimately a decline and death, right? And in most commercial markets, we restart the whole cycle and off you go again. I think, Frank, to your point about, defense tends to live longer in that decline phase. We still fight with assets from 30 or 40 years ago. And so there's less of that. And measuring if you believe in that, there are natural levels of concentration depending on where you are. And in fact, inserting competition at the wrong place, right, in the life cycle may actually be, counterproductive rather than productive. And so as you run through all that data, I would argue you want to put that lens, and in some cases you should you should see. So for example, the aircraft drone one, you would want to peel apart the two, aircraft versus UAVs, and you tell me now what you see in that data, and I think you'd still have a lack of competition on one side and plenty of competition in the other. That's the other thing I've also noted in the past, right? The industrial policy shop would always put out their annual reports and sit there and say, competition's fine, I got plenty of competition, right? Well, why? If you look at the areas that they were looking at, cyber, UAVs, hypersonics, all the new tech areas, left of the curve, you're going to find plenty. Who does the Congress hear from? The guys on the right. Last two manufacturers of blankety blank, or the last manufacturer of blankety blank, right? And so that's the last component that I think also colors this discussion. And a lot of times it's not pulled out, and that element gets lost in the debate, right?
Thank you very much, Pierre. Let me dig down a little deeper. One thing that struck me across, I always look for the common threads as we go through that first set of answers. And one thing that struck me was what seemed to me like a common thread on the importance of market structure. And by that I mean, sort of big, medium, small, and how the different segments interact with one another. In other words, the big can drive out the medium can has at risk essentially from the small and the large. And then, obviously the small firms, depending if I could incorporate, Pierre, your concept of I know it's not necessarily your original concept, but your point about the maturity of the industry and how that can affect the players as you go down. So, I was really intrigued by this idea that, maybe we shouldn't focus on overall competition / consolidation, but examine the health of the different size factors of the market structure and what they're doing, how they're reacting to one another. So I kind of want to ask folks, whoever is interested in tackling that, should policy be focused more, for example, on the middle tier? Just to kind of put out a pointed question, because we obviously have government policy that focuses on small business. We have a industrial policy that is trying to establish a certain degree of competition at the top tier, but we really don't have any kind of policy that I could easily cite and explain focused on the middle tier, or would that simply just interfere with what we're trying to do on the other tiers?
I'll start. Andrew raises a really good point. The thought occurred to me, I think as Pierre was speaking, that the imperative for industry is always to grow. I mean, it's the number one thing I think they teach you in business school, grow or die. And what happened with the Last Supper and the consolidation in the 90s was that the market dramatically shrank very quickly for defense industry. And you either had to sell or buy, because that was the only way. There were no other choices. You couldn't be complacent and just wait and see what happened, because the market just doesn't accept that kind of behavior. I was at a company in those days, part of those days, Raytheon, which was a late mover, and ended up making some acquisitions which put it seriously into debt and caused the company a lot of trouble later on. But they did survive, and they did do it by using acquisition as a way to fend off some of the shrinkage that would have occurred if they had not done that. So the structure does matter, and that's all a part of it. The other thing that interacts here is the idea of vertical integration. And it's not just who's in the different tiers, but how much some of the bigger guys, either top tier or maybe second tier even, have absorbed some of the suppliers below them, some of the capacity below them. There was a time when the defense primes did about 70% of their products in-house. That went way in the other direction over a period of a decade or so, led, I think, in part by Boeing in the commercial side, which started outsourcing an enormous amount of what it did to build airplanes commercially. And then similar things were happening at one point in the defense world, where the primes were maybe integrators and designers much more than they were producers of things. There's been a reverse in that because of this imperative I mentioned about growth. So you have to look at the structure and its ability to support the department from the defense perspective. It's hard for me to take off my old hat. And think about what it implies in terms of the kinds of business deals and products that the department can get from the industry. So I think you raised a really good point there. It needs to be thought about. I think I mentioned it earlier that there was a lot of concern as the big guys merge with second-tier people in many cases, whether anybody who is affected by that and concerned about that from an anti-competitiveness point of view is going to speak up or not, because that's the person that they're actually a supplier to in many cases. So that affects behaviors. It also affects the kinds of deals that the government gets in terms of the arrangements that are made before somebody does a bid that the government then finds itself locked into, and there are plenty of examples of that. So yes, is the short answer to your question. Again, I don't think we're in a kind of a crisis place there at this point in time, but given the kinds of behaviors that we're now seeing, some of which were mentioned, it's something we ought to be paying attention to.
Pierre?
I think you've really touched on something. I think there's an element of there's never more a greater amount of mischief generated in this topic than the notion that one size fits all, right? And so when the policies are set that way, that's where things get screwy. So from the perspective of, but rather than tier, I would argue again, you want to look back at either sector or technology clusters, to the extent that aircraft is going to behave differently than shipbuilding or cyber, et cetera. Take the simple notion that you sit there and say we have 6 primes, but if you start looking at it sector by sector, it's actually a duopoly in shipbuilding. There's 3 aircraft makers. And so suddenly look at it from that perspective, and there's different elements. And so. And same thing again with if you do it by sector, there will be a natural ordering of the tier depending on the complexity of the task and what's being done. I can't get a 5-person startup to build me a submarine or an aircraft carrier, no matter how innovative they are and how much I would love them, and if I gave them $10 billion to do it, they're not going to do it. You need a large company of scale and critical mass to do that. You need them in some cases, and actually even in some IT things, right? A startup is not going to maintain the gig for me, right? On the other hand, if I want some interesting, innovative, algorithms of cyber, right? And so the element of how big, I think, depends partly on the technology. Last comment I would make is that there has definitely been a distortion, though, between we've let the market forces generate the bigs in the sectors. Small business policy has kind of insulated or created a pool. And what you're sensing about the mid-tier in certain sectors, right, where the issues become loud, it's a large chasm to get from the small all the way up to the large, right? And people are dying in between, and therefore, we're not repopulating that group. No one has done the analysis and the work to sit there and say, is that a good thing or a bad thing that I don't have that mid-tier? So that's a good research place. In some cases, I think you do want them because they've normally been the transmission mechanism of technology, right?
I mean, I agree that actually a focus on middle tier is actually probably a smart thing. And there's one area, one country to study would be Germany. Germany has done one of the reasons that German sort of, and this is more consumer-oriented industry, has been so successful is that they've made a special effort to protect the middle tier sort of industrial corporations. But these are, and one of the things about sort of middle tier or small, sort of corporations that are not super large is I think there's an ownership issue that we sometimes forget about is when you have super large corporations, they don't, often the folks that run the corporation, that are making the decisions on a day-to-day basis, they don't really understand all the things that are inside, under their roof. And so they kind of lose things. They don't develop things that, ideas that would be a great idea. We see this throughout the political economy, but and I'm sure it's the case within the defense industrial base, is that, once smaller firms feel more ownership over the capacities, the skills, the technologies that they have within, and they're going to do a better job of promoting those ideas. Now, another question that we have to be factoring in, and I'll just touch on this briefly, is corporate governance. Corporate governance law in the United States and practice, not just law, but practice, changed pretty radically in that same period in the early 80s. There used to be, and this is very roughly speaking, but we went from this kind of, what you might call a stakeholder model to a shareholder model. A stakeholder model is when you're looking, it was a little bit more German. You looked at different, corporations sort of owed their allegiance to many different groups. To some extent labor, but to the community, to the nation state. With the shareholder model that's really become the primary model, people are taught, and this is actually not the law, but but people are taught, and we are come to expect that the primary purpose of private sector corporations is to serve the interest of the shareholder. And that also leads to a certain attitude towards the skills and the capacities and the technologies that are sort of under the roof of the corporation.
Okay. Well, I had kind of planned out maybe getting to international as the last topic, but it's been opened, and I want to follow that opening because I think there's two ways, at least it occurs to me, where the international sector could play a big role in this discussion. One is, the implications of trade, full stop, right? There's a lot of implications that you read constantly in the press that expanded global trade leads to more consolidation in industry, and that essentially big business is an outgrowth of globalization. And then related to that defense industry, we are now in a period where there's a huge focus on defense trade. The current administration has an initiative underway to try and expand arms exports from the United States for multiple reasons. Has a lot of potential political saliency. There's some complicating factors with that have emerged, but the numbers have gone up. They went up actually quite a bit in the Obama administration, and they have been high and remained high and continued to increase in the early years of the Trump administration. So also, on the other hand, there's the potential that having more players in the market, because you open up access to Israeli companies that could compete. So for example, in the UAV market, where there may already be some robust competition, but they're going to make it that much more robust. Or you may have, obviously we had the competition for the tanker that involved a non-U.S. firm as a prime offerer. So how do you see international trade, defense trade, kind of playing into this issue of consolidation? Is it a benefit? Is it something that's going to make us need to worry less as a government about consolidation in defense industry? Or is it is it potentially something that should make us even more concerned about consolidation trends?
Okay, I guess I'll go first again. You raise a really interesting question. This is one of the other ways in which defense industry defense market is not necessarily like commercial markets. I mean, we're talking national security here, so there's it's politicized, of course, but also it's about something that there's an understandable desire to have come from U.S. sources because of their reliability in wartime. That said, we have a lot of very close allies around the world, and I always argued for greater openness to bringing in some of our close partners, and I still do. I think it expands competition, expands innovation, it strengthens our partnership. So there are a lot of good reasons to bring international firms more into doing business with the Department of Defense. And also it can be reciprocal. Right? There are very few international defense firms that I've encountered who do not want to grow their business in the United States. Almost all of them would have that as an objective, either as a very key strategic objective or one which is at least something they're looking for an opportunity to do. It's hard. There are some barriers to entry. I don't think it's impossible at all. And what I generally tell foreign firms is that if you can get into a competition to do something in the United States, you'll be treated fairly. The trick is just getting into the competition. And there are arrangements we've set up. Brett Lambert here has got a lot of history with this sort of thing from his previous life. Special security arrangements with firms and proxy boards if necessary, so they can have U.S. entities and do business. And I encourage people to try to do that because I think the competition and the innovation that can come from it is worthwhile. But the history of it is very limited. You mentioned the tanker. My read on the tanker was that the U.S. Air Force at the time was perfectly willing to award that contract to essentially a European-based design. And they did the first time around. They lost a protest because they had done it in a way which didn't, as far as the GAO or the court was concerned, didn't follow their own rules. And they had to go back and revise the way they did it. They wrote the second solicitation to be protest-proof, but that gave them no real latitude in terms of when the bids came in, who they were going to pick. It was pretty much driven by the way the cost proposals were written. And I think a lot of people interpret that as a movement away from a European source to a U.S. source. I did not. I think it was an artifact of just how the history played out there. The lesson I took away was that U.S. service was willing to award to a non-U.S. source for that product. And I think that would be the case in other instances as well. Our operators, frankly, with exception, but generally speaking, our military operators who decide what gets bought. I was going to make this point earlier. Another unique thing about the Department of Defense and the defense market is that you can't just invent a better widget and hope that somebody will buy it. The widgets, like Pierre mentioned with submarines, are too expensive, and they take too long. Textron built a small fighter on its own that I don't think it's sold yet. Scorpion's called. Everybody wants a fighter. Go talk to Textron. They're trying to sell some fighters. But the U.S. military is not buying it, and because of that, they're having an incredibly difficult time finding any buyers, even though it's a pretty good product as far as I can tell. So it's hard to just make a product and take that risk and bring it to the government and hope that people will buy it. That doesn't happen very often. Our operators jealously guard their control over the requirements for the things that get bought. And that's an impediment, frankly, to innovation. I think, to give an example that's out of one of my associations, unmanned surface ships are out there now and prototyping. You could easily build a stealthy, unmanned small ship that could do a variety of missions and buy them in quantity. But to do that, you'd have to give up some of the current manned ships that you're buying to make that trade-off. And I don't think our operators are ready to do that. So industry reacts. Industry sits out there and looks at, okay, what will the customer buy? What are they prepared to buy? But I don't think that the international boundaries are sacrosanct at all. I think it's quite possible for foreign firms to sell here if they have better products. I think it's more easily done if you team with a U.S. entity to do that. But I continue to encourage our foreign partners to try to build their businesses in the United States.
I just wanted to add also with something about tanker, if we're going to rehash that whole thing, which is, that you would think that the global kind of nature of the business would create more competition, right? Maybe only Boeing is the only U.S. company that wanted to compete, but then you have EADS teamed with Northrop the first time around. And I remember the EADS CEO saying, look, we're a global company, just like Boeing. We're all kind of global companies. Let's go and compete. But and maybe the Pentagon saw it that way, and the service was open to it. But then you have Congress too, which did not see EADS as a and Boeing as global companies equal in their eyes. And so I think, and this is sort of a testament to how unique this industry is, where there are more players than just the buyer.
If I could pick up on that, it's true. Politics does matter to some degree. But I always advise, and if there are any international firms represented here, if you can get into a competition, politics are out of that. Politics do not affect source selection. So if you can get into a competition and win, and you have to still have a protest too, which EADS in that case did not, then you'll be okay. That's the key, getting into a competition so that you're into an objective process.
I mean, one thing that's been clear is the ability to grow internationally has actually acted as a dampener on consolidation domestically. Right? When the companies, I saw that behavior when the companies sat there and said, "Oh, I can," that drive for growth, which is there. If they can satisfy it by going international, it's fine, and suddenly there's less of that. Take that away, and then suddenly the imperative gets there. We had that unique moment in time in the late 90s, right, where the market was collapsing globally. Everybody thought that there wasn't anywhere to go. That triggered then this creation of these big multinationals. And once again, I think that reflected a particular point in time. The more we're back to the land where technological differentiation is the military order of the day, it's going to be hard to build a global defense firm because the issues of sovereignty and technology will trump the rules of trade economics every day.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've heard a bunch of great answers. I actually just wanted to put in, I agree completely that trade is generally a good thing. Trade, going back to the beginning, trade is actually a subset of competition policy. You use trade policy to avoid monopoly. That's kind of your primary goal of trade policy. A failure of actually, we have a recent failure that I think that's worth focusing on for just a second, which was of protecting what was a semi-competitive industry. And this is what's happened, the merger between, or sort of the blending together of Boeing and Embraer and Airbus and Bombardier. It's like that's something that should have been blocked. And it should have been blocked both for commercial reasons and for defense reasons. It's these mergers are going to increases pressure on jet engine makers. It increases pressure on which is already extreme on on Pratt and Whitney and GE, so this is it doesn't, those mergers served no one's interests other than those of Boeing shareholders, really. So that's, it would have been in the interest of the United States people to actually keep both Bombardier and Embraer as independent corporations. And just one little statement on sort of the idea of national champions. It's a terrible idea.
Great, thank you. I want to open up now to audience questions because we've got about 15 minutes left, and I do have some more things I want to ask about, but sometimes I get really lucky and someone from the audience asks the question I was planning to ask anyway. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand, and if you could stand up and say who you are and ask a brief question. First hand I saw was in the back, so let's do that, then we'll come forward.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Dale. I'm an independent contractor. And how does corporate venture capital play a role within the defense industry within this environment?
So again, it goes in waves and contexts. Been around long enough to remember the original Thales Ventures and SIC Ventures, et cetera, of the, again, of the 80s, 90s. It's back. You see it re-rise back, and it's back, but it has changed. So in the 90s, people did corporate venture capital as a mechanism of technology spin-off. I must have all this defense IP that I should be able to take into the commercial world. Let me set up a corporate venturing arm, and I'm going to create telecom companies, et cetera, right? And everybody points to TRW that had gallium arsenide technology, created RFMD, and at one point it was equal to 40% of the total market cap of the company through that one stake. So everybody wanted to duplicate that. That was the thing of the day. Kind of went away. The corporate venturing of today has been much more about this sense of there's a whole bunch of technology going on in the rest of the world. I need a way to reach in and sense it, touch it, understand it, follow the trends with it, because I can't possibly, do it. So if you look at almost all of the venture capital arms of those guys, they're more in a sense and respond and try to capture, and jump onto the early trends of technology. Certainly, that's how Lockheed has changed theirs. Airbus has been in that mode. Boeing, et cetera. So today, it's being used as it's a substitute for M&A. In some ways, it's an early version of it, and in a way, a hope to not have to go all the way there because they can pick it up early.
I'll just add up here so that I've seen venture capital used as more in a way as a technology scout than as actually a venture per se, with the idea of getting 1 out of 10 and getting a huge return. The problem with the defense market is it just doesn't buy a lot of stuff. When it does buy things, it tends to buy them in modest quantities. And while there is some dual-use potential for certain technologies, DIU is an attempt to do venture capital of a kind from the Defense Department. And it's really about accelerating the flow of technology into the department from the commercial world. And in return, small firms get some investment money, basically. Some of the big defense primes have their venture arms. And again, there it's as much technology scouting as it is trying to actually get a high return. So it varies. People keep trying. I was involved with a firm briefly that's, I won't mention the name, but they're out there now. Their model is to basically be a source of seed money, funding, early stage funding from the government to firms. So they're essentially acting as an interface between startups and the Department of Defense, people who have science and technology money mostly, to get early stage investments up to, say, $1 million or $2 million, that kind of thing, into startups to get their products further developed so that they're available, in this case, for dual use. So that's another model that people are trying. So I don't see it as a major player, I guess I'll put it that way, but there are pockets of people attempting to do things like that, with different degrees of success, I'd say.
And I do think that they're a little bit inspired by DIU. I think the case the companies have made to me is it doesn't make sense for the government to go work with these startups. That's going to be a big challenge for the startups to work with the government, and also for the government doesn't know what it's doing. I mean, this is their argument, is that we can be the liaison, we can find the technology, we can incorporate it into something the government already knows how to buy, we already have the compliance people, let us kind of do that. That's the pitch as they go out there and try to find these early stage companies.
I won't bore you with an extended rant, but I have kind of wondered about an alternate history of the recent past, where when you consider that a lot of these Silicon Valley firms were founded in the defense industry's backyard, using technologies that grew out of the defense industry, there's an alternate universe where some of them invested in these companies. And as you said, Pierre, they would probably, their valuations would be like 80% in tech. But that didn't happen.
Thank you. Joe Schneider. If you would put your crystal ball on, how would you see the industry 10 years from now, since this is a long cycle industry, but it's so different 10 years out? So I'm just curious your opinions.
So I've been doing a mental game. 10 years is a little harder. You can sit there and say, than 20 years. You can sit there and say it's going to be relatively the same. I can trace every company in the top 6 today back to the 1930s, right? The way this industry changes the most is by the introduction of a new domain or a new place, right? So all the defense companies beforehand were armaments or shipbuilders. I invent the aircraft, and suddenly I have the arrival of the companies, Lockheed, Northrop, Boeing, right? Trace them all back. Showed up in the 30s. I invent this thing called electronics, so I suddenly now have a new domain, and that's where Hughes and Texas Instruments, Raytheon shows up in my list, and it changes the industry. The last change I had was a policy one. I decided to outsource services, things that were inherently governmental, right? SAIC, Booz Allen, and then now all of these. So you tell me what technology or new domain shows up in the next 20 years, and I'll tell you who the next batch of defense companies are. If you say there is no new one, then I'm going to tell you it's the same list of names, in 20 years. My go-to candidate list was, as scary as it is, biotech, right? That in the top 10 defense contractors, you tell me that there's, in fact, I'll take everybody in this room out to dinner at the Inn at Little Washington if there isn't a biotech company, in the next 20 years. I think I'll win that one. But lately, we've been thinking something around data, right? That data is becoming the new domain, right? I hate to use the word cyber. I don't want to use the word big data, but in and of itself, it's becoming something to operate in, of, through. So is there a set of companies that live and breathe that space?
What about space?
Space we have. They showed up in the 50s.
It could be different. Right?
Yeah, so aircraft has changed and evolved, right? This is, in terms of a major, yes, are we going to see new guys fall out and new guys show up within that industry? But chances are, again, the large scale of the major players stands in the way of somebody making it all the way from small to multi-tens of billions of dollars to short circuit, because the shareholder thing of, I will drop a 13 times EBITDA multiple on you. You want it all today, or you want to slave it out for a couple of years and try to make it 10 years from now? It gets really hard to say no to. It takes a particular personality type, again, to stick their middle finger up to that offer. And there are some.
My answer is that it depends, and what it depends on fundamentally is what the customers are going to be buying in 10 years. That's Pierre's point, I think, basically. If they keep buying the same things, it's going to look pretty much the same. If we take technologies like artificial intelligence and the various types of artificial intelligence, and we apply them to making the kinds of platforms that we buy now better, then we're going to have an industrial base that looks pretty much the same, because that's what those people know how to do. If, on the other hand, there is a transformation towards greater use of large quantities of autonomous systems, you might see a very different industrial base emerge from that. I think that the future of warfare is headed in that direction. I don't know the pace at which the U.S. will go in that direction, or the globe in general, other players as well. But it goes directly to Pierre's point about UAVs and the proliferation of UAVs. And when you do something new and you're experimental initially and you have a lot of new designs show up, people experiment, they try a lot of different things. There are a lot of businesses associated with that. And then somebody wins, or 2 or 3 people win, and then that's what people build. I mentioned the unmanned surface vessel the other day, a moment ago, and there is one that the Navy and DARPA built. It's gone back and forth to Hawaii recently. We could see a transformation where that happens. I'll tell you quickly about a study I did before I left. It was unclassified. I asked somebody, one of the programs that DIU found was something called Saildrone. It's a small company that makes essentially autonomous sailboards. And they are ocean going. They can stay out forever. They're solar powered and wind powered for the propulsion. They're monitored on AIS, the system that all the ships use to track shipping, and there's some remote control capability, but potentially they operate on their own. So I asked one of my people on my staff, say, suppose I were to buy a lot of those and try to instrument the Western Pacific. How much money would it cost and how many would I need? So we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation that anybody could do, and if you assume that a really sophisticated version of that cost about $1 million, and you buy 1,000 of them, you pretty well instrumented the Western Pacific with unmanned surface vessels that are out there as scouts for you. That's a total cost of $1 billion. That's pretty damn cheap to instrument the Pacific when you look at the Defense Department's budget. But is the Navy about to embrace that? The problem we had with Saildrone, by the way, was that DIU found them. They were all excited about, there was an earlier version of DIU, DIUX, and I think the Navy bought 3. Well, the Saildrone people wanted to sell 3,000. They weren't going to make much of a living on 3. That still has not happened, but that potential is still there. Now, is somebody going to embrace that potential and actually make that transition? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll give 2 scenarios. One scenario is if we actually don't do anything on competition policy, and that is that, say, 10 years from now, we'll see Google and Amazon as major players in the defense industrial system. And, 12 years ago, there was a company called Motorola. 12 years ago, there was a company called Nokia. 12 years ago, there was a company called Ericsson. They're all gone. They've all, 2 corporations, run what's in your pocket, Google and Apple. Google and Apple are now targeting cars. I mean, General Motors, Ford, one of the reasons that they're actually starting to pull back and their sort of certain types of investment has to do with, where, are they going to be able to come up with a system that they actually control? The Germans actually are very freaked out about this, as you can imagine. So we do nothing. I think we'll see perhaps some of the corporations either inhabited by Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple operating systems, or else just acquired, because if you look at the speed at which Google and Amazon are growing, the amount of capital they will have for acquisitions, it's like even the largest of the big 6 right now will look like pocket change. So why not play with that? But the other alternative is, what happens if we actually have a sort of a renewed competition policy in the United States? And in that case, I think we're going to see a much more robust and sort of diversified and competitive industrial system, and actually both for the defense system and for the larger commercial economy. And I think that's actually what's going to happen.
All right. Was there one last question? I think there's one hand in the back there. So.
Hi, Dan Stern. I'm a student at CSIS across the street. I was wondering, this was alluded to by Mr. Hunter, regarding the growing internationalization of not just defense sales, and this is indicative of the administration's effort to increase foreign military sales and also the Obama administration. But given the growing international sales abroad and the international M&A, I was wondering what that means for the future relationship between the U.S. and major primes. I think this could be kind of illustrated. Lockheed Martin's former slogan, I think, was "We never forget who we're working for." The current slogan is "Your mission is ours." If that conjures an idea of what I'm getting at.
Right, not necessarily interpreted the same way in every country. Panelists with thoughts on how the increasing internationalization of defense trade could lead to changes in government-industry relationship.
It's something that I've seen governments fret more about than the companies. There was once upon a time a view that you could build a global defense company. I haven't heard a CEO or board talk about that recently, because the nation state, and theoretically the nation state was going to go away, right? And we have to worry about these unaccountable multinational. In defense, once again, we seem to trump all the rules, and a lot of these guys who tried to do that have woken up with harsh realities in whatever form you want to pick in terms of examples of, whoa, wait a minute, I do have a customer that matters. And so what you hear people more talk about than building a global defense company is multi-domestic or multinational, right? Which is an homage to the fact that they are national sovereign players in each of those places, right? So if you're going to play in the places that you do the correlation with the countries that have the most amount of spending on research and development and are trying to contain France, UK, US, Japan, etc.
South Korea.
I don't think South Korea. I don't think you're going to get a lot of the broader multinationalization trend seems to have stopped in defense. Now there have always been countries that haven't cared, right, or fine buying exported weapon systems, and in which case then I think all the natural and normal behaviors are in play.
All right, thank you very much, Pierre, and I think that does take us to the end of our time. But I want to again thank Greg and Zach for the work on the report, because they did all the hard work, and I just got to sit up here and bask in the glory of their efforts. And thank again the Naval Postgraduate School. And please join me in thanking this excellent panel for a great discussion.